Today we're going to work on getting the basics for our weapon system set up. So that's going to include creating the weapon prefab that is currently just going to consist of the root weapon game object with the weapon script attached to it, and our base game object that has the sprite renderer and the animator. We're also going to start by importing our sword base sprite sheet and two sword sprite sheets, and just doing some basic processing to that, and then creating our animations for the sword base. We're then going to work until we get to the point where when we play the game and we give our attack input, so left or right click, the character is going to do the first sword swing and then stop. Because in the next episode, we're going to work on detecting the end of an attack so that the player can return to its normal states. So welcome to Barden. My name is Heinrich, and let's get into it. Okay, so this is the starting state of the project that is available over on GitHub. There will be a link in the description. Let's just quickly run it and make sure everything's working the way we expected. So our character can move around, we can wall jump, slide down, crouch, all those fun things. Okay, and then one thing that does happen is if we left or right click, our character is going to disappear because we're going into an attack state. If we take a look at our player and then open up, we can actually close these tabs, sorry, and then open up our animator. You can see over here we are in this empty animation state that simply sets our player's sprite to a clear one. So we're in the attack state and nothing is happening. So let's just quickly take a look at the attack state and have a refresher on how that is currently working. So let's come down to our player folder and our player states, substates, and then over here let's open up our player attack state. Okay, so as you can see, our player attack state is completely empty. It simply inherits from our player ability superstate, and then we have our constructor over here. So how do we get to this state? Well, if we come and take a look at our player grounded state, let's come to player, player states, player superstates, and then open up our player grounded state. So in here, if we go ahead and scroll down to our logic update function, over here we take a look at our player's input handler, and we take a look at our attack inputs. And then we have a enum defining what is our primary and what is our secondary attack input. So let's go ahead and quickly take a look at our input handler. So if we just control click on these and head up over here, you can see that we have an on primary attack input function and a on secondary attack input function. And these just simply set a Boolean in a Boolean array called attack inputs to true or false. And you can see over here, we also use this combat inputs enum to define which one we want to set. So that's basically all that's happening over here. On the Unity side of things, we can come to our input folder and take a look at our player input actions asset. Stock that over here. You can see we have a primary attack and a secondary attack action. And to these, we have our left button assigned to primary, as well as the Western button on the gamepad, and then our right mouse button or the upper button on our gamepad assigned for the secondary attack. Let's go ahead and close this. Then on our player game object, we have this player input component that is just part of the input package. And over here, we have our player input actions asset assigned. And then if we come down to events, you can see we have gameplay events. And over here, we have simply attached our primary attack and secondary attack actions to those functions in the player input handler. So it's as simple as that. Any states where we can attack from, we have this transition to the attack states. And so currently that should only be in the player grounded state and then also in our player in air state. So let's take a look at that. Player in air. Let's go ahead and scroll down here to our logic update function. And yep, as you can see over here, we have our two transitions to either our primary attack state or our secondary attack state. So just a quick refresher on how the attack states are currently implemented. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is let's create our weapon game object. So underneath our player, let's go ahead and create a new empty game object. And I'm just going to call it weapon for now. Now what I'm immediately going to do is I'm going to turn this into a prefab because we have our primary weapon and our secondary weapon, and they're both just the same thing. Any instance of a weapon in the scene is going to use this prefab. So let's just go ahead and make it a prefab. Now let's come down to our prefabs folder, which is over here, and let's just drag it in there. Let's then just go ahead and drag another instance of this prefab underneath our player. And let's rename the first one to our primary weapon. And the second one we'll call our secondary weapon. So we're not going to work on any of the other game objects yet. Before we do that, let's go ahead and create our weapon script. I'm actually going to do this in Writer. So let's come back here and let's scroll down to our weapons folder that was already there. So if you don't have this, just go ahead and create it. It's weapons in our scripts folder. So in here, we can right click and say add, and I'm going to add a Unity script. So using Writer allows me to create a variety of different files. If I were to click just class or interface, it would just create a normal C# class or interface or whatever I choose. And if I click Unity script, it's going to create a mono behavior. And you can see actually here I can choose if I want a mono behavior, scriptable object, and a bunch of other things. So this is just going to be called weapon. Now, why I wanted to create the script using Writer instead of Unity is because I'm going to start using namespaces. Now you can think of namespaces as just convenient ways to help organize your code and make it so that you can have different classes that have the same name, but don't overwrite each other because they sit in different namespaces. Now I'm not the most knowledgeable on namespaces just yet. Using them is kind of a new thing for me too, so I'll link a couple of really useful tutorials in the description that go over namespaces quite well. But you can see here that my namespace is now called _scripts, which is our root scripts folder .weapons. I want to call this Bardent. So I'm actually going to click on scripts, click F2 to rename it, and then I'm going to call it Bardent. But now I don't constantly want to have to rename this namespace. So let's quickly come back to Unity before we do anything else in the weapon script. And then let's come up to Edit, Project Settings, and then at the top right, let's just search for namespace. Now, if we scroll down just a little bit, you'll see over here there is this root namespace setting. In here, I'm just going to enter Bardent. And that should be all. Let's go ahead and close this, and let's come back to our editor. Now, I'm actually just going to try and create a new file quickly. Just a test script. And let's make sure. There we go. The namespace is now bardent.weapons instead of _scripts.weapons. But I can just go ahead and delete that file. So like I mentioned, our weapon class is going to be our communication hub for our player attack state and the weapon itself. So that means our player attack state actually needs to have a reference to this weapon. So before we do anything else in here, let's go ahead and add that reference to our player attack state. So if I just hit Shift twice, I can go ahead and search for our player attack state. And in here, before our constructor, let's just go ahead and declare a private weapon. So this is the specific weapon that the attack state is referencing. So remember that we have a primary attack state and a secondary attack state, which is just two instances of our player attack state. So we need to be able to set this reference somehow. And because this isn't a mono behavior, we can't just make this public or serialized field and drag it in. We need to pass it in from our player when it initializes the states. Let's come to our constructor, and after the animation boolean name, we'll go ahead and declare a weapon like that. That's kind of annoying to see. Let's go ahead and just fix this. So now when we initialize our player attack state, we have to pass in a weapon. And then in the constructor, we simply say this dot weapon equals weapon. Let's also just make this look a little bit better. Okay, so if that, it means we need to come to our player script and go ahead and pass in these references. So Shift twice, type player, we want this one. And you can see we now have an error over here in our Unity callback functions region, because over here where we declare our primary attack state and secondary attack states, we no longer pass in this weapon. So the first thing we need to do is actually reference the weapon over here in the player class. I'm just going to come up to my other variables over here, and after the vector2 workspace, I'm going to declare a private weapon, and I'm going to call it primary weapon. And then I'm also going to declare a private weapon, secondary weapon. We then need to set these references. Now, instead of having to drag it in the inspector, let's just go ahead and find this in our awake function. So before we initialize all our states, So I'll just do it after we get the core. I'm going to say primary weapon equals transform dot find. And in here, I'm going to pass in the name of the game object, which is going to be primary weapon. And of course, you have to make sure that this is spelled exactly the same as it is in our hierarchy. After that, I want to say then dot get component. And the component that I'm looking for is the weapon component. Let's just go ahead and copy that, paste it down here. Now we're going to do the same thing for our secondary weapon. And instead of primary weapon, we have secondary over here. So now that we have this reference to our primary weapon and our secondary weapon, we can go ahead and pass it in down here. So primary weapon for our primary weapon and secondary weapon for our secondary weapon. Sorry that it's going off the screen there at the end. Okay, so let's come back to our weapon script. And let's go ahead and create our first function. We're going to create the enter function, which is what the attack state calls when the state first enters. So this will be a public function because it's getting called from another class. It's going to return void, and we're going to call the function enter. It does not have any input parameters either. So for now, all I want to do in here is simply print a message to the console. So we can just say print, which is shorthand for debug.log. And in here, I'm just going to print the weapon's name. So I can say $sign to create a formatted message. And then if I put some squiggly brackets, I can put in a variable, which is going to be the transform.name. And then I'll just add enter so that we know it's the enter function. So now we actually need to call this enter function from somewhere, and that is back in our player attack state. So let's go there. So in the player attack state, which inherits from player ability state, which again inherits from player's state, we're going to override our public virtual void enter function. And in here, we're just going to call the enter function on our weapon. So let's come back to player attack state. We can then type override, hit enter, and then we can select the function we want, which is the enter function like that. Remember to leave base.enter. And then after this, all I'm going to say is weapon.enter. Simple as that. So let's go ahead and test that out in Unity quickly, just to make sure that everything is working the way we expect. Make sure the weapon references are getting set correctly. So if I left click, it is not getting set correctly. Okay, so let's see what happens. So an object reference is not set to an instance of an object. What is happening? This is how weapon equals weapon. So the weapon isn't getting set correctly, which probably means that we're doing something wrong in our player script. And I actually know exactly what it is. Okay, so let's see what that might be. Let's come back to Unity and let us click on our player. And let's just put our inspector into debug mode. And we can see over here, okay, our primary weapon and our secondary weapon were not set because I am a fool and I have not yet added the weapon script to our two weapons. So what we can do is click on our primary weapon, put this back in normal mode, and then say add component, and we want to add the weapon component. And then over here you can see now we have this little plus icon, which means this is in addition to our prefab, meaning that this prefab is no longer exactly the same as the prefab in the prefabs folder. So if we click on our secondary weapon, we don't have the script here yet. But if we come back to our primary weapon, and at the top right over here, you can see it says overrides. If we click on that and we say apply all, you can see the little plus icon disappears. And now if we come to our secondary weapon, you can see it also has the weapon script. Okay, so we all make mistakes. Let's go ahead and test it again. So if I left click, primary weapon enter. Now right clicking isn't going to do anything because we can't transition out of our primary attack state to our secondary attack state. So we'll just have to run the game again quickly. And if I right click, secondary weapon enter. Perfect. Okay, let's move on. Now, one thing to quickly note, if we just quickly take a look at the scripts over here, you can see here that we've declared our private weapon variable for the player attack state, but we put that weapon in a namespace. So you can see that my editor automatically has added using bardent.weapons at the top over here. So if I were to just delete this, you can see now that it doesn't know what weapon is because we need to include this weapon namespace. And the same thing would have happened with the player script. Now note that if our player attack state were to also be in the Barden.weapons namespace, we wouldn't have to do this, but we're not going to set the namespace for this. Maybe in the future we can do some cleanup and put everything in correct namespaces. But for now, I'm just going to create namespaces for things moving forward, and we'll just neglect the old code like the oldest child. So what we need to do now is import our new attack sprites. So let's come down to our sprites folder, and then come to our player folder. And let's go ahead and create a new folder called combat. And then in here, I'm going to create another new folder. And we're starting with the sword, so I'll just call it sword. Now we can go ahead and import the sprites that I have linked in the description. We have our base sword.png, or sword base. Then we have our sword 1 and sword 2. Now obviously you could just select and drag all of them, but shh, don't judge me. Okay, so let's just quickly adjust the settings for all of them. So we can go ahead and select all of them. And we want to change the sprite mode to multiple. Our pixels per unit for this art is 16. We can then come down to our filter mode and change this to point no filter. And our compression is just none. Then go ahead and hit apply. Now we need to go ahead and split all of our sprites. So let's start with our sword base. We can go ahead and click on the sprite editor, hit slice, and then we're going to change it from automatic to grid by cell size. And the cell size is 64 by 64. Go ahead and hit slice and then apply. Next, we need to do our sword 1. So sprite editor, slice. This time it should remember that we want to do grid by cell size. So we can just hit slice and then apply. Next, we can come to our sword 2, hit sprite editor, slice, slice, and then apply. Okay, so now we have all of our sprites. Next, we need to go ahead and create our base animations for the sword attacks. So let's come to our animations folder, and then in the animator controllers, we can come to our player folder, and let's go ahead and create a new folder called combat. Now in here, we don't have to create a folder for every weapon because there is only one animator controller per weapon. So in here, let's right click and say create animator controller. Now I'm going to call this animator controller sword underscore base underscore weapon underscore AC for animator controller. We then also need to come to our animations folder, come to our player folder, and basically do the same thing. I'm actually going to create a new folder and just call it movement, and then put all these animations in there. So that's our player controller's movement animations. What's in this old one? Okay, so these are some old animations that we don't really need anymore. So I'm actually just going to go ahead and delete that as well. Next, let's go ahead and create a new folder. This one is going to be called combat again. And then in the combat folder, create a new folder called sword. Now in here, let's go ahead and right click and create a new animation. And I'm going to call this one sword underscore attack underscore 1, like that. Now I know that my animation sample rate for all of my animations is going to be 15. So let's go ahead and open this animation, dock the animation window down here, and then just change the samples to 15. So now when I duplicate this animation 2 more times for the other 2 attacks, we don't have to reset this every time. So click on it, hit Ctrl D twice. Now, unfortunately, Unity isn't smart enough to rename this for us correctly. So let's just go ahead and click on the one we want to rename, go to the end, call this underscore 2, and then this one is going to be underscore 3. So next we need to go ahead and add these animations to our animator controller. So to do that, let's come to our primary weapon, right click on that and hit create new. This is going to be our base game object. And now again, note how it has this plus and isn't blue because it isn't technically part of the prefab, but we'll go ahead and add it in just a second. Next, we can come and say add component. And here we want to add our animator. And we also want to add our sprite renderer. I'm actually going to move that above our animator like that. Okay, let's come back to our animator controllers folder and let's add this animator controller to our animator. So now we're able to open it up over here. We can then come to our sword animations folder and let's just select all 3 of these and add it to our animator. Perfect, so let's just go ahead and do a little bit of cleanup here. So I'm going to move my entry node over there, put attack 1 over there, attack 2 over there, attack 3 over there, and then our exit node over here. Move this over here. Now we're not going to deal with the transitions just yet. Let's go ahead and add our sprites first. So let's go back to our scene so we can just make sure our animations are working. So in the animation window, we have sword attack 1 selected. So let's come back to our sprites folder, and then let's expand our sword base. Now you can see there are 15 sprites, meaning 5 sprites per attack. So select 1 through 4 and then just drag it in here. If we go ahead and hit play, we're not going to see anything because our sprite renderer is on the wrong sorting layer. So come back to the base game object, and then on the sprite renderer component, we want to change the sorting layer from default to our player. And we're going to change the ordering layer to 1. So if you play the animation now, we can see there is our sword swing. Now, of course, it's a bit fast, so what we're going to do is we're just going to change the spacing slightly. So what I like for the attack animation is I like the anticipation to be a bit longer. So you can see our second frame is already our impact frame. So let's go ahead and select the last 4 frames and move them over like that. So that's a little bit better. Next, what I want to do is I want to come over here. So you can see we have our impact frame and then our like kind of secondary impact frame. I want this one to last a bit longer as well. So I'm going to select the last 2 frames and move them over just 1. So we have 1 empty frame of that before we start the recovery. That looks a lot better. Okay, so that is our sword attack 1. Now let's go ahead and do the same for our sword attack 2 and sword attack 3. So sword attack 2 means we're using frame 5 through 9. Go ahead and drag that in and do the same thing again. So I'm going to move the last 4 frames 2 over, and then the last 2 frames 1 over. Run that. That looks good. Okay, now for sword attack 3, that means it's frames 10 through 14. Put that in there. Now for this one, I actually want to make the anticipation a little bit longer. So instead of 2, I'm going to do 3 frames. Let's see how that looks. Nice, okay. And then I'm going to move the last 2 frames 2 over. So this is a longer, heavier attack. A heavy slice. I don't know if that's good. We'll see. We can always adjust this later. Now what's actually really nice about this system is if I were to adjust the timing of these frames, I don't have to go and adjust the animations for every single weapon's attack 3. I just adjust this one and all the timings will match correctly. Beautiful, this is what was stressing me out about the old system. Okay, so with all of these animations created, let's come back to our primary weapon game object over here, and let's just go ahead and apply the overrides to our prefab again. So now our secondary weapon also has a base game object, and the animator is also set to this sword base weapon AC that we have. Okay, so to finish up this part, we're going to get the player to play the first attack animation. And then I think that'll be a good amount of setup for today. So let's come back to our scripts, and we want to come back to our weapon script. So I can just control click on that. Now, the first thing we're going to need is a reference to our animator. So we'll just create a private animator, and we'll just call it anim. Now we need to set the reference to our animator. Now remember that our weapon script sits on the root weapon game object, and our animator sits on the base game object, which is a child game object of the root game object. So let's also just go ahead and store a reference to the base game object. So we'll just create a private game object, call it base game object. And let's quickly go ahead and set these 2 references. So underneath the enter function, I'm going to create our awake. And in here, we can start by getting a reference to our base game object. So we'll say base game object equals, and this time we're again going to use transform dot find. And the transform that we're looking for is called base with a capital B, and then we can say dot game object. Next, we can set the reference to our anim with anim equals base game object dot get component. And the component that we're looking for is our animator. So now all we need to do is tell our animator to play the animation. But to do that, we need to set some sort of parameter in the animator, which we have not set up yet. So let's quickly go ahead and do that. Let's come back to Unity, come to our animator, and then over here on the left, let's come to parameters. And the first parameter I'm going to create is just a Boolean called active. Now what I want to do is I actually want to transition from entry to our sort attack 1 animation only when active is true. So that means we need another animation state to be our default state. So let's just right click and say create state, empty. I'm going to then rename this one to empty. And this animation state is going to hold our empty animation, which we've been using in the player controller series. Now, all of this is it's just an animation with a single frame, and that single frame has nothing in it. It is just an empty sprite, like that. Let's then right click on our empty animation state and say set as layer default. I'm actually going to move all of these down like that. So next, what we want to do is right click on empty and create a transition to our exit node. And then click on that transition, open up our settings, and we're going to make sure that the exit time is 0. And we actually also need to untick has exit time, which then disables this exit time, so it doesn't really matter. Then we need to change our transition duration to 0 because we want the transition to happen instantly. Next, we can go ahead and create a transition from our entry node to our sort attack 1. Click on that. We can then come to our conditions and add a new condition, and that is that active is true. And actually, I think I forgot to add the condition for our exit transition. Yep. So in the transition from empty to exit, come down to conditions, add active must be true. We can then come back to our sort attack 1 state, create a transition to our exit state, and this time our condition is that active must be false. Then don't forget to again do the same thing where we untick has exit time and set the transition duration to 0. So that's the basic flow. Let's go ahead and quickly create the transitions to the other attack states as well. Okay, so these 4 transitions aren't really going to matter much because we don't have a way of controlling which attack animation is playing. We're only ever going to play the first one. We're going to need some sort of counter to keep track of which animation should be playing. So let's just go ahead and create that. It is a in parameter, and we'll just call it counter. We can then come back to our first transition and add another condition, set the condition to counter, and then equals 0. Then we can come to our second transition, add that exact same condition again, so counter equals, but this time 1. And then our third transition, do the same thing, counter equals 2. Now we're not going to be implementing the counter logic in code for this. This is just to make sure that we're going to transition to our first animation. So let's come back to our code, and then in the enter function, let's go ahead and say anim.setBool, and the boolean that we want to set is called active with a lowercase a, and we just want to set it to true. So let's come back to Unity. Let's come to our game window, and let's run the game and see what happens when we attack. So if I click, you can see that it played the first attack animation. Now again, we're still stuck in this state, so nothing we can do about that other than restart the game. Let's just make sure that our secondary attack also works. So if I right click, the same thing happens. Now it's probably a bit annoying that we're stuck in that animation, so we need to work on our animation events. But I think we've covered a decent amount for this part. I don't want the episodes to run too long. So in the next episode, we're going to work on our animation events. So that weapon animation event handler component that I showed off in part 1. But that is going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And so again, if you want to have early access to the completed source code for the project, it is available over on Patreon to all of my supporters, no matter the tier. But it also will be available publicly eventually when the series is finished. But so before I go, I would just like to say thank you to all of my supporters and wonderful people over on Patreon. And a huge special thank you to Cody, SM, Madger, Jake, Patrick, Atami, and Mike for your support. You guys are absolute mad lads, and I hope you guys all have a wonderful day.